All right, so we have something a little bit different today. I have my first ever guest. This is my dad, Barry, and he's been a photographer since well before I existed. And I actually take on most of his hobbies. So the whole watch thing that's been going on, that's because of him. Photography is because of him. Anything that I'm interested in basically comes from him. So I would like to make a series out of this where I interview other creative professionals. However, I figured the first person and best person to start with should be my dad. All right, so roll the intro. And let's get started. So, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with, how about you tell me about your photography journey?
My journey began in high school. I think it was my junior year, so that would have been 1979, 1980, with a Canonette QL17 that I bought at Ann & Hope at the Liberty Tree Mall in Danvers, Massachusetts. And it just so happens you just got one of these and you have it here. And I haven't held one of these since probably 1980, because after about a year of this and I started getting seriously into photography, I moved over to an SLR, which was a Ricoh. Can't even buy a Ricoh SLR anymore. You can buy a Ricoh copier, but no SLRs. But what I didn't realize until much, much later, like when I got into Leica, we'll talk about Leica in a little while, I think, is that my photography journey started with a rangefinder. And I love the fact that, of course, I live with rangefinders now in Leica, but the journey actually started with a rangefinder.
So you did film cameras, obviously, through high school, and then that Ricoh SLR. Yep. Tell me about how you got into digital photography.
I got into digital photography actually with really terrible equipment at the very beginning of digital. I mean, just really consumer, very low megapixel stuff. I think I probably had like an early Canon, but not one of the nice Canons. Right. I had a Kodak when Kodak still existed. So really just cheap stuff. I had the Kodak with me on a trip that I was leading from my university to Europe, to Rome. Took a bunch of photos with it, enjoyed using it. And on the way back, we were at the airport in Germany, and I saw a Sony. This is before Sony was really a thing in photography. It was their very first. It was a DSLR. It was before mirrorless. And I just bought it in the airport. And so that Sony Alpha became my really first good digital camera. And I used that for several years, and just for things on trips and personal. And this is really before a lot was happening in social media. This was 2007. So there wasn't a lot of sharing going on, but I used that.
Okay. Then I believe at some point after that, you got your hands on a Fuji X100?
I did. I think there was probably one or two small cameras in between, but then I did get the Fuji X100, and that was really like a revelation for me, because first of all, it's a fixed lens, f2, beautiful lens, and it was an APS-C and the equivalent of 35 millimeter focal length, and it got me into street photography, which I'd never known about before, and I started researching and learning about street photography, and I studied up on people like Henri Cartier-Bresson and Kappa and some others, and that really became a thing for me. So that was really my gateway from the Sony and a couple of cameras that followed that, which was really photography for me and perhaps for the university, the trips that we were on, but not really much more than that, and into really trying to develop a craft. And I think it was the X100 where I really got the interest in developing a craft.
Okay. And then at some point after that, you actually had the same camera that you advised me to get as my first camera, which was the Lumix LX100.
Yep. So the Lumix LX100 was kind of like a gateway to Leica for me, because Lumix, Panasonic, has had a deal for many years with Leica on sharing some lens technology. They're made in Japan or made in China. They're not made by Leica, but there's a lot of technology sharing and quality control that goes into those Leica semi-branded lenses. And that's where I first really got into thinking about Leica. Although it didn't occur to me until much, much later that around the time that I had the Sony Alpha, we were living in Sacramento at the time, and there was still a photography store. There aren't too many private photography stores anymore. I handled a Leica in that store and just kind of played with it while I was looking for a lens for the Sony. And so that would have been the first time I actually held a Leica during that Sony phase.
I actually remember him coming home and talking to me about it. When I was in high school, I took a photography class, and it was all film photography, but I actually got to work in a darkroom as well. And I wanted to get into photography at that point, but it actually was more than a decade later that I ended up really getting into it. But I do remember you telling me that you held a Leica, and I had read some of his photography magazines and knew a little bit about what Leica was, and that was really cool to me too. So that brings us to Leica. You've had 3 Leica bodies.
Yep.
Tell me about those.
So the first one, you can't quite say a body, because the first one was a fixed lens. It was the X2. It was an APS-C, had a 28 millimeter, I think it was 28 or 24, whatever the math worked out to with the APS-C to bring it up to a 35 fixed lens. But unlike the Lumixes, this is a true Leica made in Germany, built like a tank, and actually has still to this day, has a very strong cult following. And it was a neat little camera that I kind of kitted out with a grip and a hood. And so even though it was tiny and pocketable, by the time I got done with it, you couldn't fit it in your pocket anymore.
It's kind of like the predecessor to the Q series, right?
Well,
no
yes.
viewfinder.
Yeah. So it didn't have a viewfinder, but it did accept the X1 preceded the X2, and the big advance in the X2 over the X1 was that it accepted an electronic viewfinder, which you could put into the hot shoe, which I also got. So I had the camera, I had the hot shoe, I had the grip, I had a half case, I had an EVF sitting on top of it, and it was almost as big at that point like a mirrorless today.
Okay. So then after that, you got the M8.
So after that, and by the way, all the way in these, I take care of my cameras. I take care of them very well. And the nice thing is I get to trade up and get a fair amount of money. That's why I traded in the Sony and I traded in the Lumix. I got something back for them. The nice thing about Leicas is if you take care of them and you're getting an older Leica, it's almost like renting, because you can pretty much get what you paid for it, if not a little bit more. So that was true with my X2. And I traded in my X2, put a little bit more money in, and I got my first M. You know, the whole time I had the X2, I loved being in Leica land, but you felt like a second-class citizen with an X rather than an M. Because when you think about Leica, you think about the 100 years since the development of 35 millimeter photography. That's where it all started. And the M that was introduced in 1957, and every lens from 1957 to today still fits. So that whole trajectory of Leica in photography, you kind of feel like a little off when the Leica you're holding isn't an M. And so I definitely wanted one. And so I started with the first one, which was the M8, came out in 2006. It was an APS-H, which you probably haven't heard of because that was the only APS-H. So at a crop factor of 1.3 instead of the crop factor of 1.5, which you get an APS-C. So it was in between an APS-C and a full frame in terms of the size of the sensor. It was the body of an M. It was everything about an M. It didn't gain the great respect, sort of begrudging respect of the Leica world, because it wasn't full frame. But full frame was not ready at any kind of useful price point at that point in 2006. So the M caught on a little bit, but not so much. Interestingly, it's a cult camera. It's still a cult camera. It had a really big problem that they found out only when it was in the field, which was that there's a super thin IR coating on most sensors, and the testing was not quite rigorous enough. So the IR coating was so thin that there were IR issues when you were taking pictures, particularly, and sounds weird, if you took pictures of somebody wearing black polyester, which happens, right?
Yeah.
It came out purple. And so as soon as Leica found out about that, they shipped to all M8 owners a couple of filters back then, which would take care of it. But of course, a lot of Leica users don't like to use filters because it's more glass between you and your subject. And actually, I will tell you, I did not use the filters when I had the M8. I didn't want any more glass between me and the subject, and I just dealt with whenever it happened to have black polyester, which is really the only place that it happened. Like black cotton didn't happen. It was black, and so black polyester didn't all that much. So I actually didn't use the filter.
I guess you could just convert all those to black and white.
So the neat thing about the M8 is it was a fantastic black and white camera. So after the M9, which we'll talk about, Leica launched the monochrome M, which was black and white, monochrome only. And the M8, even though it was already generationally behind, became known as the poor man's monochrome because it really does a great job in monochrome. Because that IR coating on the sensor was so thin, that also made it a really good black and white camera.
Okay. All right, so that was the M8.
That was the M8. Traded it in. I say traded it in. I sold it on eBay. I bought it on eBay. I sold it on eBay. I sold it for exactly what I bought it for. And I had wanted an M9, and the M9s, this is a couple of years ago, were going for $2,500 to $3,000 or so. And that was a little more than I wanted to spend. And then I found out about another camera, which turns out to be just like the M9, and that's this one here, which is the ME220. So in 2012, Leica launched the Leica M240, which we can talk about. But when they launched the M240 and they retired most of the M9 line, not quite all of it, but they retired most of the M9 line, they also launched this one, the ME220, which is essentially the M9. It's the same sensor, same electronics, same everything as the M9, with a couple of minor differences. First, they gave it this anthracite gray paint. So you know it by looking at the anthracite gray that you're looking at ME220. They took off the frame line selector, which isn't the most used Leica feature anyway. It's a little switch that when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can see what the framing would look like if you were using a different lens, not all that well used. And they also took off the USB jack, which almost nobody used because it's a very slow USB jack. So most people just took the SD card out anyway to load it up to the computer. So no harm done. And actually the nice thing about the USB jack not being there, it made it slightly more waterproof. It's not a very waterproof camera, but it actually helped a little bit. And so this is the one that I have today. It is full frame, 18 megapixels, which sounds low by today's standards. The new Leicas, the M11, well, the M11's in the 60-something megapixel range. The M10R was in the 40-something megapixel range. The M10 was in the 20-something megapixel range. And then you've got this at 18. 18 is still big enough for poster size. Yeah, right? Absolutely. There's an interesting debate in the Leica community. This sensor and the M9 sensor were made in partnership with Kodak, actually, and they were based on CCD rather than CMOS technology. This is the last digital camera to be based on CCD. Well, there are a lot of people out in Leica land who believe that out of the camera, the colors on the M9 and the ME220 look like Kodachrome film. It's just a very pleasing look. Now, there are a lot of people have done some serious research into it. The people at Red Dot Forum, they've got a great show that you can watch on YouTube, competitor of yours. They probably have a few more viewers, maybe. All right, okay. The people who run that show, and which is also the Leica store in Miami, did a lot of quantitative research, and they have proved pretty conclusively that that actually is not really true. that you can make it look like anything you want. But it's beautiful. Out of the camera, it really requires very little tweaking in RAW. I do just a little bit with it, but a lot of the stuff that I do is pretty close to out of the camera with just a little bit of tweaking.
Okay. All right, so as you said, this is an M9, and they're quite a bit of a cult classic among Leica digital photographers. So there's a huge asterisk on the M9 line.
There is. So if you thought the M8 problem of the thin IR coating on the sensor was bad, it was learned somewhere in the 2010 to 2011 range that there was an even bigger problem with the M9 sensor, which is it would corrode. And corrode means if you use an interchangeable lens camera, you have gotten dust on your sensor. Digital, of course, right? It is impossible to avoid getting dust on your sensor. And early corrosion looked like dust spots. But as it corroded more, it was clear that it wasn't just dust spots. And this affected almost every M9 and ME220. Leica did an amazing customer service thing. They actually paid for the replacement of the sensor and did a refurbishment of the camera when they did it, came back with a good warranty, and they really made good on the owners of the M9s and the ME220. That kind of customer service you don't get too much these days. You still get it from Leica in lots of different ways. It just is a wonderful customer service company. But that was a big problem. So if you're in the market for an M9 or an ME220, you need to make sure that it's had a sensor replacement. There is a way to tell. There's a keypad on the back. There's a sequence of buttons that you hit, and it'll bring up actually the service menu. And so there's a code that you look for, which you only get if the sensor has been replaced. If you're buying one, you should look for not just that, but you should look for the documentation. So when I bought this, it came with the box. I like getting original boxes. It came with the original box, all the original packaging, and it came with the letter from Leica with the serial number that matched the serial number of the camera, talking about the date when that service was done.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that customer service replacement program, that expired.
So that expired a few years ago, and for a little while, it looked like that was it. A couple of private companies have stepped in, and they are doing sensor replacements. The sensor replacements are in the neighborhood of about $1,000. An M9/ME220 is still going in the $2,500 range. So if you get an offer for an M9 with a corroded sensor, or even if it's not corroded, but it still hasn't had the sensor replacement, and it's around $1,000, but everything else checks out, it might be a good deal to buy it and get the sensor replaced. It depends how much it is. I wouldn't spend too much more than that, because if you get into $1,200-$1,300, now you're talking about $2,200-$2,300, including the sensor replacement. If you keep an eye on eBay, you can find M9s and ME220s for that. Keep
an eye really close. They go very quickly.
They do. And in fact, that's how I ended up with the ME220. I just kept watching and watching and watching. I didn't see any of the M9s. I mean, the one that I really wanted, I wanted the M9P. From the M9 forward, there wasn't one with the M8, but from the M9 forward, each generation has gotten a P variant. That goes back to the Leica MP years ago, back in the film days. There has been, not disagreement, but there has been differing opinions on what P means. I think, I'm not going to call it consensus, but it's probably something like 60-40, would say that P means press, because the MP was made for press photographers. Others will say it means professional. What the P series does for each camera, so M9P, MP240, M10, M11P hasn't come out yet. What all those Ps do, one is they take the red Leica dot out, And behind this, actually, interestingly, you wouldn't know that until we actually saw the P series. Behind this red dot is a flat head screw, and that flat head screw is used to adjust the rangefinder. Don't do this at home. Leave that to Leica. Okay, but that's what's behind the red dot. Well, a lot of Leica photographers do things like putting black gaffer's tape on top of the Leica red dot because they don't want to be noticed when they're out there. Okay, so the M9P does away with the red dot. On the top here, where this is totally flat, can't see anything there, on the top plate of the P series, you have the Leica script that goes back to the Leica cameras back in the film days back from the 1950s, right? So you've got that. And then depending upon the model, they might do something else. For the M9P, you got sapphire glass in the back instead of, well, it wasn't quite Gorilla Glass then, but something kind of like that, right? For the M10, which is interesting, the difference between the M10 and the M10P was actually pretty significant because not only did they do all of the cosmetic stuff, but they gave it a touchscreen. The M10 didn't have a touchscreen, the M10P did have a touchscreen. And they actually changed the shutter mechanism in the M10 so that it was just this little snick. It was much quieter in the M10P than it was in the M10.
All right, so the M9s are on eBay, you said, for about $2,500. Mm-hmm. For somewhere around there, maybe slightly more, sometimes slightly less, you can get the successor, the M240. Why would you not go for a 240 and go for an M9 if you saw them at the same price?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The M240 is probably the least loved digital M. Even less, I would say, than the M8. A couple of things happened with the M240. First is they added video to it, which no Leica shooter ever actually wanted. Was not a popular feature. It's the only one that had it in the two models since, the 10 and the 11, no video. And to support all of the different things that they were doing with it, principally, it actually has something called live view. So you can actually see what's happening in the lens from the screen on the back, which is, well, one could say that it's very un-Leica-like, but it's not bad. It's not a bad thing, right? But it requires a lot of battery power. They increased the size of the battery, and they actually made the camera even chunkier. So if you compare side view, the M8 and the M9 to the M6 and the M7, which were the last film Leicas, these are just a touch thicker, pretty close, but just a touch thicker. The M240 is even thicker still, and it really does look chunky, right? So losing the profile of the film Leica, having video, and then there's the whole naming thing, because people expected that to be the M10, but it wasn't the M10. It was just the M, and Leica's reasoning at the time was, we have a Porsche 911. It's always been the Porsche 911, and there are different models of the Porsche 911 over the years. Okay, I mean, that works for the 911, right? That did not go over all that well in Leica land. And this camera, for example, this is the ME Type 220. I mean, we just call it the ME 220 for short, but it's the ME Type 220 because this came out in 2012 right alongside the M240, which is actually, if you want the long version of it, it's the Leica M Type 240, which is what you'll see on the plate. Okay. For all of those reasons, it is just not the most beloved M. When the 10 came out, they didn't just make it thinner than the M240. They made it thinner than the 8 and the 9, and it matches the dimensions of the M7. Plus the other advancements that are in there, but they went back to really conventional, traditional Leica, and guess what? They took away the video button. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. I think that about covers it. If you guys like this kind of video, I hope you did, then we'll probably do some more. If you didn't like this kind of video, I'm still going to do some more because I do what I want on this channel, and hopefully you guys like it. In fact, as I said, I do love watches, and I got it from him, so I'm hoping to be able to do a video on his Doxa. All right, that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave them down below, and I will be happy to answer them as soon as I can. All right, have a great one.